the dynamic system exploration of the retirement system, and we're calling our presentation The Coming Retirement Crisis, which you'll see why here in a second. Can we transition to the, there we go. All right, so here's the team. Those are our LinkedIn pictures, in case you're curious. All right, so what's the background for the for this project? Effectively, when in the United States, we have a really well-known retirement system called Social Security, and everybody believes that they know what it is, but it isn't completely clear to everybody how the system works. So when Social Security was established back in the 30s, the concept was that Congress was going to tax workers at a certain rate and collect that money into a trust fund. And then as those workers retired and grew older, they would take the money from that trust fund after it had accrued interest at whatever rate the government had accrued interest at, and they would disperse that money back out to folks who had retired. The large issue is that when Social Security program was invented, people didn't live as long as they do now. And so the concept of putting money away in a trust fund made sense at the time under given circumstances, but as the system evolved over a couple of decades, we saw that people started living longer and they started retiring earlier, and this led to a significant pressure on that trust fund. So as the trust fund accumulated over decades, we have come to the point now to where we see a significant large bulge of a couple of generations that are moving into the retirement system that aren't being replaced with a commensurately large generation coming behind them. So what that means is that folks that are contributing into the retirement system, what we're calling the makers, that I'll explain here in a second, are contributing at a lower rate because there's fewer of them than folks who are taking from the retirement system, or population we call the takers. And because of this nuance of the system, we can see, and you'll see from these plots, if you look at the one on the left, this is from the Congressional Budget Office, and the blue line represents the net value of that of the trust fund system that Social Security has created. And you can see that the blue line, it goes up right now until about 2025, and then it starts a steady decline until it reaches zero or goes below zero somewhere out after 2040. And the issue is that once it goes below zero, you are now required legally to disperse more funds than you're taking in. So there aren't enough taxes going into the retirement system as there are obligations to pay out to it. So obviously that creates a significant issue in terms of burdens on the rest of the federal budget. So this project is about exploring this concept. And the way we've done it is that we built a generalized dynamic system model that categorizes the population into three discrete sections. So you have the takers, those are the retired populations, classified by T. You have the makers, and those are the folks who are contributing taxes into the trust fund, into the retirement system. And then you have the supported, and those are the children. And so the way the model works is it's a population flow model. You have children that flow into the makers, and then makers that flow into the takers, and then the takers leave the system after passing away. I'll go over some of the nuances, but the basic dynamics break down into this B times T being greater than 1 minus R. And if that condition is met, then the eigenvalue of the system is greater than 1, and we see stable growth. And like I said, the conditions are on the slide here. We'll talk a little bit more about it here in just a second. The population model feeds into a revenue expenditure model. So the makers are making a certain amount of revenue, and the takers are receiving a certain amount of expenditure. And you can see that the revenue model has three components as well. E is expenditure. Those are disbursements on Social Security. R is revenue. Those are taxes collected specifically for Social Security. And then F is the trust fund amount. So those three components have dynamics as well. And you can see in the center there's conditions for the eigenvalue to be of the system to be larger than 1. Have to do with this alpha being greater than beta minus 1, where alpha is the growth rate, meaning how quickly revenues grow, and beta is the rate of growth of expenditures. So what we saw from the initial build of the model and pulling data directly in from all of the official federal government sources is that, first of all, the maker population is slightly decreasing, right? So we're seeing the maker population, the population of folks contributing to taxes, is actually going down over time. And then by 2032, right now our base case model, like we had showed you in the first slide, is consistent with the Congressional Budget Office. We see the exhaustion of the trust fund in a few decades. And then by 2060, we see the taker population will increase dramatically. And you can see the percentages up there, but that's pretty significant. Effectively, what we're saying is there'll be a large bulge in the coming decades where a significant amount of people will be drawing from the retirement system. Now, that will be have a temporal horizon, so that population will eventually be passed, but it will create a short-term significant budget crunch. All right, so from the base model, I want to cover real quick the outputs and the indications. So at the top, you can see that for the generalized model, it was very similar to grabber-holder, which makes sense because the grabber-holder model was based on population flows from market dynamics, and so we have effectively the same considerations here, except we're talking about dynamics of retirement system. So this concept of B times T, which are the rates that have to do with the growth of the population, B being the birth rate, and T being the transfer rate from the supported into the maker population. So the effect of people being added must be greater than G, which is the effect of people leaving the taker population, right? So you have to add more people into the populations that are generating revenue than you have of the effect of people who are growing in the taker population, which makes sense. So it's consistent mathematically with what we would observe. And then with the revenue model, which a general model is nested inside, we see that this alpha function, which is the function of revenues, has to be larger than the effect of expenditures, which we see here as beta minus 1, which also makes sense intuitively, right? And so what that means is that if we want to ensure that we're doing well, if we want eigenvalues that are greater than 1 for the generalized model, which is what we find when we plug real data in, we'll see some sort of stable growth in terms of revenue and expenditures. However, when we plug real data into the revenue expenditure model, we see eigenvalues really close to 0, which is what we observe with a trust fund. It tanks really quickly in just a couple of decades, goes to 0 right away. So what we want to do now, the generalized model, we have done some legwork to pull a bunch of data in from different places and made a very detailed model, which I'll hand off to Travis to go over.
Okay, so we're going to use our detailed model, which I'll go over in a second, but we basically started from our generalized model with the implications that Isaac discussed, which were 3 major focus areas where we're really looking at influencing that taker population. We're looking at the retirement age, which means in essence we're reducing the taker population. Immigration would increase our maker population, which increases our workforce, and actually the retirement age does the same. And then we're looking at 2 sides of the economic model, so increasing revenue through higher taxes and then reducing benefits. So I'll go into the detailed model. So just like the generalized model, the detailed model has 2 components. It has the population model that feeds into the financial model. So this is just a snapshot of the population model. And what we did is project the population of the United States out to 2060. And we used our model to do it, but then we validated our model with available U.S. Census data that actually projects out to 2060 as well. So we're very, very close. The real takeaway is in 2060, total population of around 4.5 million. So the population of the United States continues to grow, albeit at a slower rate than is currently growing at, and that's really predicted by our eigenvalue discussion, as Isaac mentioned. Also, we broke up the populations into the support, the maker, and the taker, as we identified earlier. Now, the base case for this is 0 to 18 for the supported. It's 19 to 67, which is the full retirement age for a current Social Security rate, and then 68 and over is the taker population, so that's the retired population. And just a couple of things to point out with the graphs here. On the left-hand side, you can obviously see population continue to increase, but you can tell from the slope, and what I do want to point out is the slope of the taker population, which is the gray line. It's aggressively increasing, and that's broken down a little bit clear to see here is that the percentage of the total population that's the taker, the retiree population, increases pretty dramatically. So the shape of the demography for the United States is changing. So you're ending up with a larger proportion that's in the retirement retired age portion or the taker portion, which is really driving the exhaustion of the trust fund. Okay, so, and then a few outputs from the detail model on the financial side, which is we modeled revenue, so incoming revenue. We modeled expenditure. We modeled interest income because the federal government does earn interest on the trust fund as it's currently established. And then really the key output from the model is this trust fund value, which you'll see displays a very similar curve to some of the more sophisticated models that we saw from Wharton or from the CBO. So trending down over time, and as we discussed, our current base case model shows the exhaustion of the trust fund at 2032. So this is our base case that now we can experiment off of to determine some of the impacts of the policy adjustments that we want to make. Okay, and I'll go into more depth with this when I give you a demo of the model, but basically we had 4 policy options plus a composite option. And our recommended option was this composite option. And the composite option basically included certain components of these other options. So let me go through those very quickly. So increase the Social Security retirement age. I realize this is difficult to see, but we increased the Social Security retirement age from 67 by 1. So each one of the curves is by 1 year. So increasing it to 68, 69, et cetera, 70. And then the larger value there, or the curve that's separated, is 75. So as you can see, not only every year we extend the life of Social Security by a certain amount, and we also begin to approach sustainability when you get to a retirement age of 75. We understand the implications of that, and that's going to be politically very, very difficult in this political environment. So I'll get back to the composite model and what are the components of that in a second. But that's one easier way to solve this problem, but we understand it's unlikely to happen in this political environment. The next one is increase the Social Security tax. Also politically difficult, but there have been discussions in many policy areas, because at the end of the day, most people do recognize that a revenue increase is required. And although our model offers you the opportunity to increase them separately, because the employee pays half and the employer pays half of the overall Social Security tax, we modeled it as an increase for both of them, resulting in a net increase. So you can see the resulting change. We then looked at across-the-board benefit reduction. So there's progressive benefit reduction, which is known as means testing, which is if I'm of a certain income level, I receive less benefit. We did some initial modeling on that, and we found that it has very minimal effect. So across the board is really where you can gain back some efficiencies, and you can see the plot there. And then finally, we looked at perhaps pro-immigration policies within the United States. Again, politically, we seem to be going the other way on that right now, but if we were to enact pro-immigration policies, what would be the net effect? And what we found was very unlikely, because the percentage of the population that's resulting from net immigration is very, very low. So even if you increase that growth by up to 500%, which is the largest value on there, you don't get a lot of gain. So overall, our composite strategy was our recommendation to spread some of these policies out across the entire population, because we don't want to negatively affect any one of the population and make them shoulder the burden for these policy changes. So for example, we increased the retirement age by 2 years, 67 to 69. There's an across-the-board benefit reduction of 7%, which is fairly mild compared to some of those that have been suggested. We also tax income. Right now, income for Social Security is capped at $18,500. So we continue to tax all the way up to $400,000, which generates more revenue for us. And then I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of the model demo and some of the things that we can do with it. So we just put a basic, fairly simple front end on our model here, and then we have all the resulting curves. So let me zoom in quickly, so the real takeaway that we want to look at is obviously the trust fund value. So let's start with the retirement age. As I increase the retirement age, the purple line is the new as a result of my policy change. So as I increase it, obviously, not only is the value that's here, which shows the trust fund year exhausted. Is that changing? That's increasing, but I'm also beginning to flatten out the curve, which means it's getting more and more sustainable. So as I increase it, we also looked at, like I said, this progressive benefit reduction. So the progressive benefit reduction, as I increase, it has very minimal effect because it's only affecting a smaller portion of the population that's defined by the highest tax bracket in the United States.
One other thing, as you're going through this tool, that I want to point out. So as he's updating these values, it also updates the generalized model, so we can look at the eigenvalue trade-offs and
Yep.
know when we cross one of those thresholds, which is effectively.
So interestingly enough, something that starts to have a real impact is when you start to have GDP growth over the projected amount. We set ours at 1.1%, so generally economists are predicting in the United States economic growth between 1% to 2% over the next 50 years. But if you start to get economic growth higher than projected, you really start to have an impact on the resulting income amounts within the maker population, and as a result, you start to level this curve out and really have an impact. So, and these, obviously we can do a different combination of these, and this is really how we came up with a composite strategy that we're recommending, which is increasing the retirement age, across the board benefit reduction, increase the Social Security tax by 2%, and then reduce or increase the tax of the maximum taxable value, which I said down here is it's actually set at $118,500, but you can go up to $400,000, which will, at the end of the day, begin to reverse the trend of having more revenue than we do expenditures, and will extend the life of Social Security. So with that, we welcome any of your questions or comments.
So from your analysis, basically, it seems that there's not much one can do.
So,
Is that what it said?
yeah. So I would say that there are things that we can do. All of them are going to have significant political
It's gonna have
costs.
a significant. So I think maybe another interesting question is that Social Security is founded at a certain time, was the right thing to do. Is that the right thing to do now, or maybe?
So interestingly enough, Social Security was founded at a time when the life expectancy of the United States was less than the retirement age that was established by Social Security. So that was a dynamic that, to get it passed, they set that up. Now, to your point, there's been an